Harari. The generation that remembers what life was really like is ending. Have you ever sat with an elderly person, someone in their 80s or 90s, and felt beneath the ordinary surface of the conversation something that pressed against your awareness with a quiet and growing urgency? Not nostalgia exactly. Not grief exactly. Something more precise than either. The specific sensation of being in the presence of a kind of knowledge that is not written down anywhere, that cannot be transmitted through any digital medium, that exists only in the living memory of people who actually inhabited a world that is otherwise available to you only as history, as data, as the second-hand reconstruction of something that can be described but never quite recovered. And the awareness, growing quietly beneath everything else, that this knowledge is running out. This feeling, which many people have experienced without fully articulating what it is pointing toward, is not sentiment. It is not the generic sadness of watching older generations pass, which is simply the universal human experience of time moving in one direction. It is the perception of a particular threshold in human history. A threshold that is approaching faster than most people have allowed themselves to consciously register. The threshold at which the last living human beings who formed their fundamental assumptions about what life is, what community means, what work feels like from the inside, what privacy is, what reality is before it has been filtered through the specific distortions of the digital age, will be gone. And with them will go something more irreplaceable than any individual life. The living, embodied, experiential memory of what human existence was like before the transformation that is currently reshaping every dimension of it was underway. I want to be precise about what I am claiming, because the claim can easily be misread as a form of nostalgia, as a romantic attachment to the past that every generation produces about the generation before it. I am not claiming that the world those older generations inhabited was better than the one we currently inhabit in any simple or unqualified sense. It was not. The world of 60 or 70 years ago was, by many important measures, a world with far more suffering than the current one. More physical pain, more poverty, more racial and gender-based oppression, more exposure to the kind of arbitrary violence and arbitrary deprivation that modern institutional life has done much to constrain. None of these things are worth romanticizing. What I am claiming is something more specific and more important. The specific generation that is now ending, the generation that formed its deepest assumptions about human life before the digital revolution, before the algorithmic mediation of social relationships, before the colonization of attention by systems specifically designed to exploit it, before the systematic dismantling of the forms of community and work and relationship with mortality that had structured human experience for millennia, this generation possesses a form of experiential knowledge about what human life is like when those structures are intact that cannot be recovered once the people who embody it are gone. There is a crucial distinction between experiential knowledge and explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is the kind that can be articulated in propositions, encoded in text or data or image or video, and transmitted across any distance and any time to any recipient with the appropriate access. Our culture is extraordinarily good at producing, storing, and transmitting this kind of knowledge. The ability to access the accumulated explicit knowledge of human civilization through a device that fits in your pocket is not a trivial achievement. But experiential knowledge is different. It resides not in propositions that can be articulated and transmitted, but in the specific texture of lived experience, in the felt sense of what it is like to inhabit a particular form of life from the inside. This knowledge cannot be archived. It cannot be digitized. It cannot be transmitted through any medium except the specific medium of living human witness, the direct encounter between a person who has inhabited a particular form of life and a person who is trying to understand what that form of life was like from the inside. And when the people who have inhabited that form of life are gone, the experiential knowledge they carry goes with them, permanently and irrecoverably. The generation that is ending now, The generation born roughly between the 1920s and the 1940s is the last generation that formed its fundamental understanding of human life in a world without the specific distortions that the digital revolution has introduced into virtually every dimension of human experience. They grew up in a world where attention was not a commodity systematically extracted by commercial systems designed to exploit cognitive vulnerabilities, where relationships between people were conducted face-to-face, at human speed, with all the friction and the difficulty and the genuine negotiation that face-to-face relationships at human speed require, where the information available about the world arrived through channels that were, however imperfect, not algorithmically optimized to produce the specific emotional states that maximize engagement at the expense of accurate understanding. They know from the inside, from the specific texture of their own formative experience, what it feels like to live in a world structured by these conditions. Not as a historical fact, not as a sociological description, not as a comparison between then and now, but as the lived reality of their own most fundamental experience of being alive. And this felt knowledge, this experiential understanding of a form of human life that is increasingly available only as description and decreasingly available as living witness, is something that the current moment is allowing to pass from the world without anything approaching the seriousness of attention that its passing deserves. Think about what an elderly person who grew up in a small community in the middle of the 20th century actually knows, from the inside, that you cannot access from any source other than their direct witness. They know what it felt like to inhabit a social world in which every person you encountered in daily life was known to you, in which the web of relationships that constituted your social existence was built over years of actual shared experience rather than assembled from the managed presentations of curated online identities. They know what it felt like to be genuinely bored, to sit in a quiet room with nothing to do and nowhere to go and no device to provide stimulation, and to discover in that boredom the specific quality of inner life that emerges when the mind is left genuinely alone with itself. They know what it felt like to receive a letter, a physical letter written by a specific human hand, and to understand in the receiving of it that the words on the page represented a specific person's genuine effort to communicate something that mattered to them across a distance that made that communication genuinely effortful. They know what it felt like to learn a skill from another person, slowly, through direct transmission of embodied knowledge in a shared physical space, and to understand in the learning that they were receiving something that had been developed over generations and that they were now responsible for carrying forward. They know what it felt like to be part of a community in which your presence or absence at a particular occasion mattered in a way that was immediate and concrete, and felt by specific people who actually knew you, rather than registered as a metric in an algorithm that has no experience of your presence or your absence. They know what it felt like to face the reality of mortality without the sophisticated cultural mechanisms for its management and avoidance that the current world has developed, and to discover in that unmediated encounter with finitude the specific quality of urgency and preciousness that the encounter produced. These are not descriptions of a better world in any simple sense. The world they describe also contained genuine suffering, genuine injustice, genuine limitations on human possibility that it would be wrong to romanticize or minimize. But they are descriptions of a form of human experience that contains specific elements, specific qualities of attention and relationship and community, and work and engagement with time and mortality, that the world that has replaced it has not found adequate substitutes for, and that are becoming inaccessible as living experience rather than historical description at exactly the moment when understanding what has been lost and why it matters is most urgently needed. Because here is the specific danger of losing the last generation that remembers what life was really like. It is not the generic danger of losing the past, which every generation faces and which every generation has managed to survive. It is the specific danger of losing the living reference point, the embodied experiential standard, against which the specific distortions of the current moment can be measured and recognized as distortions rather than simply as the way things are. The people who grew up without the internet, without social media, without the algorithmic mediation of their attention and their relationships and their information environment, know from direct experience that certain things about the current world are different from what they were, and specifically different in ways that feel like losses rather than simply like changes. They do not know this as a theoretical proposition or a sociological comparison. They know it as the specific felt experience of encountering the current world from the inside of a self that was formed in different conditions, of noticing the gap between what something feels like now and what it felt like before the transformation. For the generation that grew up entirely within the digital information environment, the specific distortions of that environment are not distortions at all. They are simply the texture of reality, the way things are, the background conditions of existence that do not require explanation or justification because they have never been experienced as anything other than simply what life is like. The fragmentation of attention is not experienced as fragmentation by people who have never experienced sustained, uninterrupted attention as a normal feature of daily life. The management of relationships through carefully curated digital presentation is not experienced as management by people who have never known a social world in which the specific friction and the specific richness of unmediated face-to-face encounter was the primary medium through which relationships were built and sustained. The living memory of the generation that is ending is the most direct available testimony to the reality that the current conditions of human life are not simply the way things have to be or the way things have always been, but are specific historical arrangements that have specific costs that are not always visible from inside the arrangements themselves. When that testimony is gone, when the last person who can say from direct personal experience that attention once felt different and relationships once felt different and community once felt different is no longer alive to say it, something specific and irreplaceable will have been lost. There is a further dimension of what is ending with this generation that goes beyond the specific experiential knowledge of the pre-digital world and that touches something even more fundamental about the human condition. The generation that is ending is, in most cases, the last generation for whom the question of meaning, of what makes a human life genuinely worth living, was answered in practice rather than in theory by the specific conditions of the world they inhabited. Not because they had worked through the philosophical dimensions of the question with special care or special wisdom, but because the world they grew up in provided, as a structural feature of daily life, rather than as an achievement requiring deliberate cultivation, many of the specific experiential conditions that generate the felt sense of a meaningful life. The genuine community that embedded individual lives in webs of mutual knowledge and mutual obligation. The work that, for many, though certainly not all of them, had a visible connection to the needs of specific other people in specific places. The relationship with mortality that was imposed by the presence of death in daily life, rather than managed into invisibility by the combined efforts of medical technology and cultural avoidance. These things were not, for the generation experiencing them, understood as answers to the question of what makes life meaningful. They were simply the conditions of life, the water in which existence swam, and the loss of these conditions, which the generations that followed have experienced as a series of specific technological and social changes rather than as the comprehensive dismantling of the structural foundations of meaningful existence is visible from the outside, from the perspective of the generation that experienced those conditions as the default rather than the deliberate achievement, in a way that it is genuinely difficult to make visible from inside the conditions that have replaced them. The conversation that needs to happen between this generation and the generations that have followed it, the specific and urgent conversation about what has been lost and what has been gained, and what of the lost things can be recovered in some genuine form adapted to conditions that are genuinely different from the conditions in which they originally existed, is a conversation that has not happened with anything approaching the seriousness and the urgency that it deserves. And the window for that conversation is closing. Not slowly, not at the comfortable pace of historical change that allows multiple generations to work through the implications of a transition before the transition is complete. rapidly at the pace at which the oldest living generation always passes, which is to say at a pace that will, within 1 or 2 decades, have reduced the population of living witnesses to the pre-digital form of human life from tens of millions to effectively zero. What the people who remember life without screens can do while they are still here, and while the knowledge is still living rather than merely documented, is offer it with the specific honesty and the specific generosity that makes it genuinely useful rather than merely culturally interesting. They can offer it not as an argument for the superiority of the past, but as a resource for understanding the present. Not as a basis for mourning what has been lost, but as a basis for taking seriously the project of recovering what is worth recovering. Not as a credential that entitles them to authority over the people who do not share it, but as a contribution to the collective project of understanding what the conditions of genuine human flourishing actually require and how the current moment is departing from those conditions. And the people who belong to the generations that do not have this experiential knowledge, who have grown up entirely within the conditions that the passing generation remembers as transformed, have a specific and urgent responsibility in response to this closing window. Not the responsibility to simply accept everything the older generation says about what has been lost, because some of what they say will be shaped by the specific distortions of memory and the specific limitations of perspective that all retrospective accounts are subject to. But the responsibility to ask, with genuine curiosity and genuine seriousness rather than polite interest, that files the answer as historical anecdote, what the specific quality of the experience was from the inside. What attention felt like before it was continuously fragmented. What community felt like before it was primarily digital. What solitude felt like before it required deliberate effort, rather than simply arriving in the natural gaps of a life not yet colonized by the ambient availability of stimulation. The generation that remembers what life was really like is ending, not as a metaphor, not as a philosophical claim about change and loss in the abstract, but as a literal, demographic, irreversible fact about the specific moment in human history that we are living in right now. And the knowledge they carry is going with them. The only question is how much of it you are going to receive before it is gone. Not because the past is worth recreating. Not because the world they remember was better in any simple sense than the world you inhabit. But because the felt knowledge of what human life is like when certain conditions are intact, and the specific recognition of what their absence costs that only the people who have known both conditions can provide, is a resource for understanding the present moment that will not be available in the same form once the generation that carries it has passed. The window is not infinite. It is the window of a generation. And it is, as you are reading this, already most of the way through. What you do with the time remaining in it is the only question that still has a genuinely open answer.